Welcome to another episode of Project Samvaad by Swabhimaan, an initiative at the Center of New Economic Studies. Today, we dive into discussions around environment, sustainability, as well as inclusivity. We are looking at whether we can advocate gender and environment together. For our today's conversation, we have Professor Prakhar Pandey, who is a faculty at the Jindal Global Law School in Sonipat, Haryana. Professor Prakhar Pandey is an environmental law and policy professional with over 5 years of experience in the sector. He has worked in diverse settings such as litigation, consultancy, and academia. He is an ardent advocate of environmental and social justice and aspires to bridge the gap between theory and practice of law and policies. Currently, he's building the Environmental Law Clinic as its assistant director at the Jindal Global Law School and researches on topics such as just energy transitions, circular economy, waste management, environmental and socio-legal aspects of business activities, among other things. Thank you so much, Professor. We're glad to have this conversation with you. I think before we dive into the main questions of discussion, usually it's quite surprising to see environment and gender, two words in the same sentence. And I think even for us as researchers, it was kind of a surprising coincidence. So, could we start with a little bit of a discussion on how these two terms are interlinked? Because gender is not something which is the first thing that comes up when we talk about environment or sustainability or climate change concerns.
Sure. Thank you so much. I firstly would like to thank you for inviting me here. And also, I think congratulate you for the amazing work the team Swabhimaan is doing. It is very relevant, it's very important, and it's super amazing. So congratulations for that.
Thank you. Thank you so
Um,
much.
yeah, and I think you started on a very good note that we don't often, interlink these two words or two concepts together. I think largely, to be honest, the background of it is really because the two have been very detached from each other. Environment is often spoken of in terms of scientific narratives, technocratic narratives. It's a lot of it's a jargon heavy discipline, and has often been studied in silos in terms of scientific research, etc. So environment has also been a subset of a larger scientific narrative. So I think the sociological aspects of it have only started coming to light even more and even further since we have started understanding what environmental justice is about, what climate justice is about. But of course, there are many interlinkages that they could be direct, they manifest in very different ways based on the geographical context, based on the demography of the place, the kind of ecosystem we are in. So a lot of it has plays in terms of how those linkages manifest. I think a couple of direct ones that I can think about that are very much, sector agnostic in some sense are, say, vulnerability as a risk as a positionality of when we are looking at gender diverse groups or gender minorities. Women in particular, say in developing countries, have um, are a bit more vulnerable to the impacts that we are seeing in terms of climate change, and that is largely, I think, because of their positionality within the society in terms of how the socioeconomic factors play out, how the women and gender minor groups have limited access to resources, they have lower income, there may be certain, traditional cultural roles that they may be playing. And all of it, I think, consequently sort of restrict some sort of mobility and decision-making power. Um, Another, I think, a very important direct linkage is livelihoods. We talked about lower income. We talked about uh, uh, how some sectors are more sensitive to environmental harms and climate and adverse impacts of climate sense. There would be agriculture, so fisheries, horticultural department, forestry. All of those things are a bit more sensitive to environmental threats. Um, And yeah, availability of water, availability of resource in a particular location, could be disasters that affect a particular geographical area. So they impact livelihood to a very large extent, and have are a risk to economic security of women and other gender diverse groups. Health is again a very important point to consider, because uh, these environmental harms often exacerbate that risk of certain health risks, that it could be reproductive health, it could be simply the sheer changes in the temperature and the way rainfall happens. It affects how people, how resilient people remain to certain conditions, right? So I think, so some of those, migration is a very important direct linkage. People have to migrate because of lack of availability of resources, or extreme contamination of certain resources in and around their area. Uh, Women, I think, one very interesting thing that that may often be seen as, an indirect linkage, but is not, is that women, I think, are naturally understood to be better resource managers in some sense, because they are, traditionally, it could be because of the traditional roles, it could be because of who is the primary caregiver in the family, who is the, so it could be many factors, but they are, in the recent experiences, people have started to understand that resource management is a key skill that that comes very intrinsically to women, and it is a very important thing when we are talking about climate resilience and adaptation, and long-term sustainability for that matter. Um, yeah, I mean, some of those direct, indirect are many. Indirect, if you want to really go into the whole, SDG aspect of it, the Sustainable Development Goals, we see so many interlinkages between the among the goals themselves, and so it could be education, it could be policy making, it could be technological innovation, it could be resilience, just building resilience at the community level, the voices that often are not heard. So I think overall, I think I would sum up saying that it's not, environmental concerns, or gender inequalities, that inequities that manifest due to environmental issues, climate issues, are not just environmental justice issues. They're also very much a social justice issue, or an economic justice issue, and we really need to address these interlinkages through studies, through dialogue, through empowerment. Yeah.
I think I concur with you there. Definitely a lot needs to be done in that regard. And you did mention vulnerabilities, and we do realize, especially I think this time at COP itself, there were two panel discussions as well on the vulnerabilities, especially which women and other gender minorities face when we talk about gender, talk about climate change or environment. And you did the idea of better resource management was something which is very interesting, because we study feminist economics, which also brings into the idea how women are better at resource allocation in the sense. Despite of these interlinkages, I feel, do you think that the same has been seen in research? Because when we talk about environmental sustainability or climate change, or rallying people for that, and the research in that regard, it is very scientific in sense of emissions, or otherwise other macro policy decisions which we take. Do you think that there has been research in getting all these vulnerabilities in and these points of views?
Um, I mean, I would outrightly not deny it. It is limited. I wouldn't say that it has fully been integrated the way it should, considering the state we are in, considering the crisis that is upon us. So I think there needs to be a stronger action, definitely. But I mean, we have to be kind of, mindful that there has been a historical separation of these two, concepts, or the sectors, the movements, rather. And there are a lot of siloed approaches that have, continued to be prevalent even today, because these are complex issues. And a lot of times solutions only come from when you dive into the complexity. We should never, discourage ourselves from complicating the question. It's not always about simplification. It's a lot of times those complexities are required. So I think the historical separation does play out that role in terms of why it has not been integrated to the extent we would like it to. But and again, like I said, I think in the previous response as well, that the dominant discourse around climate change mitigation, as especially mitigation, has been predominantly technocratic or very uh, imaginary setting kind of approach where solar is the future and electricity becomes free. So it all sounds very technical and is very far removed from a normal person's life, right? We are concerned with paying the bill. If it's free, that's great for us. But I think a lot of people just do not cross that interrogation or curiosity. Um, so I think that also plays a huge role. Plus, of course, I mean, situationally, it's different. In India, it is much more different that gender biases often come from these patriarchal norms, right? That also exist within the environmental and policy decision processes, because who is getting represented in the committees who are steering a certain policy, the implementation. There are a lot of, say, for example, um, movements which are very underrepresented, local movements that
Mhm.
go underrepresented, that may have happened at just a Gram Sabha level, but they will never, receive that attention that that these complexities are arising and they need to be addressed only by ground truthing approaches. So those studies, I think, the studies that are focusing more on an STS approach, which is socio-technical approach, or justice approaches, intersectional justice approaches, only those will be able to capture these realities. And there is a stronger call, I think, for those kind of studies. And I think a lot of burden also is upon the financiers of such projects and such initiatives. Like investors have a key role to play here. Maybe we can talk about it more later. But I think, yeah, it's growing. It is growing. Although I will say that there is some missing element that we have, not been able to put a finger on and say that this is how we do it. But I think, yeah, I think it's happening at least.
So I think we end on sort of a positive outlook for the future. And I definitely appreciate the point about finance, because being a gender research group, we understand that research around these topics is very difficult to fund, so a lot of it doesn't happen. But I think drawing from what you said, even nowadays there's focus on indigenous people and
Mm.
their sort of initiatives to tackle climate change, and that is also sort of branching out to having more discussions around gender and differential experiences which different groups face, which I feel is a good step for the future. Now, we are obviously aware that a lot of times certain groups or issues remain underrepresented because there isn't a diversity of voices which comes in. And environmental movement, although now that has changed to some extent, we did not have women or other non-binary individuals leading these movements, whether it's on the front of research or protests or ground level work. A lot of times we feel that maybe having those individuals in such discussions might change things. So how do you
Mm.
think, do you think it would actually cause, create a rippling effect which might change the way we look at these issues? Or
Mm.
how does more diverse leadership needed in that regard?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. There is no second guessing the answer that diversity is needed, and it's needed in any sort of leadership roles for an effective advocacy movement. Uh, Definitely, diversity is the key. Some just representation of voices of women, of non-binary individuals, of other marginalized groups of the society, of children, bring so many perspectives to the table. We have seen how climate movement is also, being led by youth now, and
Hmm.
often, the trials that we hear of in these. Quotes about a child, someone, a collection, or a collective of children raising climate action, climate litigation before the courts. So I think, yeah, diverse voices definitely matter a lot. Um, like I said, I think intersectional approaches uh, would be key, and I'm saying that because a lot of going back to the point of finances, I think investors have started doing that. So I wanted to make that point then, but I think it is important to recognize that there is it could be coming from a goodwill, it could be coming from a virtue signaling angle, but at least we see those requirements in the, requests for proposals and RFPs and EOIs that are being floated by these MNCs now. There is a requirement of, say, for example, Green Climate Fund. I think maybe I can talk about that it has developed a set of indicators which require mainstreaming into project design and through the lifetime of the project design, where it's looking at where I think one of the projects that they funded was in Malawi, where they uh, focused on the resilience of smallholder farmers and tried to see how they create nature-based solutions, looking at the whole adaptation side and considering a key role of uh, women in terms of decision-making process, in terms of identifying customary practices that would help them mitigate the impacts and adapt better. So I think those requirements are also coming. Plus, some laws require now the whole ESG side of things, which moves these, the finances that the projects that get funded are always on these credentials. So I think there is some level of international in terms of enforcement. It's not really enforcement, but some sort of facilitation towards bringing these into mandatory requirements for the private sector, and then they automatically, then there is a compliance with the local laws. So I think it is an opportunity. It is a big opportunity to bring diversity into these actions, into these dialogues, into all of in policy making. For example, public policy is something that affects everybody. Otherwise, it is not really public. So I mean, it's as simple as that, right? So I think, yeah, it is a big opportunity, especially when we are at the junction of transitions. And this is a very growing area of research when we are looking at how we're thinking about systemically changing structures. So historical separation is understood, but it can't be an excuse anymore. I feel that when we have a chance to realign our structures based on the current societal norms, current societal requirements, the current planetary requirements. So I think it is a very good opportunity to make it more just. Those transitions become more just and more inclusive in that sense.
Um, I think definitely we need to have more ways in we bridge the gap, because essentially gender justice and environmental justice have been for a very long time separate goals. How do
Yeah.
you think we can reach a sort of common level? For instance, when I have seen advocacy groups who are advocating uh, sexual rights or reproductive rights, which can also tie into the idea of environmental justice and looking at social sustainability as well as environmental sustainability simultaneously. But they're still advocating those things very separately, which is understandable because of the way the audience also perceives it. But then, how would you sort of bring these two goals together moving ahead?
Um, it's a very tough and an important question, actually. Uh, but I think, yeah, moving forward, which is when I said climate is an opportunity, I really mean it, because climate is really all-encompassing in some sense, where it's affecting everybody equally, equitably, differentially, vulnerably, putting people on vulnerable standpoints. And so then, when you're talking about, say, uh, re- uh, uh, you know, uh, reproductive rights, or so you have to link it to the question uh, of climate, because, or say, for example, gender-based violence. When you're considering about climate migration, you have to think about how that may worsen those impacts when people are being displaced from their local land. So I think interlinking, weaving those threads, segueing from one thing to another is the only way if you want to develop holistic solutions. It has to be approached that way. And I think a starting point would be that it is taught that way, which, so I feel education again is because that we have these different streams that we excel at, we acquire certain roles, but a foundational understanding which could be developed at a school level, at a graduate level, by teaching these from interdisciplinary approaches, not just looking at one sector, not from one discipline. I think a starting point would be there. And of course, then we create a more sensitized group of people who are coming out of colleges every year and then uh, entering into these formal jobs. I think another very important question is we uh, when we look at technical approaches is to understand is to not only see it as a green is good concept. And under there may be, so like you said, I think you mentioned some time back that how carbon mitigation becomes a tunnel vision. So agreed that there are targets internationally, agreed that there may be certain legal requirements that may be incumbent, that you have to meet certain emission reduction by this. It's great initiative if that is being done. If that is being done ambitiously and very nicely, that is also great. But at the same time, uh, like I said, it is somewhere we are changing the way our society works, how energy flows in the society, in terms of, just if it's just thinking about renewable energy for that matter. I can speak for that because I work in this space, or waste management for that matter. We um, when we think about removing, say for example, our landfills that we come across every time we cross Delhi borders, of course removing them is a great initiative, but at the same time it cannot be done without considering the communities that depend on it for livelihood, and how they are also differently dependent upon that same livelihood. Removing of those landfills must be would be an would be a um, could sound sometimes to certain groups like an environmentally elitist concept, that it is coming from an lens of aesthetics, that it should not plague our city like that, a garbage landfill. But it has to be done. If you're talking about transition, it has to be done in a phased manner. It has to capture all of these interdependencies that even a garbage mound creates. So it has to go to that granular level, I think, and the layers need to be unpacked. But having a one straight jacket formula will not apply, I guess. It is very different for very different sectors. Someone who's in manufacturing sector would be experiencing it very differently than someone who is on a coastal, a fishing community. So impacts will be very different, and approaches need to be tailored according to that. But intersectionally, taking a justice approach is the only right way to go about it, I feel.
I think adding on to your example, it was very interesting to see how something like a landfill addressing it, and especially when we look at people, populations depending on those jobs, a lot of time we have women in the informal sector who are also part of such workforces. So
Yeah.
when we you spoke about looking at differential impacts on different people from different industries as well as communities. When we come together to envision a policy or like a legal framework to deal with environment or gender for that matter, and we looking at both these impacts together, how would we move ahead? One way, I think the most common way, as you mentioned, would be getting everyone on the same table for a discussion. But unfortunately, as we know through history, that is rarely something which happens or has been feasible at times. So how would we then move ahead if we want to actually address such issues? I know this is not
No,
a question which can be
be
answered
addressed
very easily or
very,
addressed very
yeah, yeah,
easily, but how would
yeah.
we sort of move ahead to envision such a thing?
So I think one very interesting example, or a model that I think could work is, especially when we're talking about localization of climate action, localization of SDGs. I think it could be a lot of these pain points, especially around coastal areas, especially the more vulnerable areas to climate, the particularly vulnerable populations. I think governance could be handed over to the community themselves, and this is something that we are seeing in some. Energy projects, and that is something that we have researched on as well. Uh, that a policy is implemented, that there would be support for 5 years in terms. So, say if a new solar uh, off-grid solution has been provided at a community level, 5 years later, it would be handed over to the community for overseeing the entire governance of that project. Uh, but at the same time, there would be questions that would be arising at the community level themselves. And those could then be resolved maybe at the community level itself. That is a whole different question that we have seen on the ground reality is, even when you do so, when that model is applied, there are still, these oppressive tendencies that exist even within the rural community, within the local communities. That it could be coming from a caste place, it could be coming from a gender biased place, it could be many things. And it is really then the question of answering that level of granularity. I think models exist. A lot of models have been developed in terms of an alternative approach to uh, it not just bringing all stakeholders together, which is a often very mooted idea that I think that would solve all the problems, but clearly I think doesn't. I think local action really could, but it should be done in a way that does not strip away rights of people. And it is even more important now that that these courts are recognizing the human rights angle of climate change. I mean, it happened in India, it happened at the ECHR. Uh, so we are seeing that there is a rights-based approach needed when we are thinking about mitigation and adaptation as well. Uh, a solar grid would be very useful in terms of creating new jobs, maybe at one point, at one side, increasing the dignity of work that women often aspire to get. So that may be happening, and those may be co-benefits of a climate action. But at the same time, there may be other disadvantages that these new setups might also create. So I think an intervention there is also needed to be at least explored, and I don't see a lot of that happening right now. So I think, yeah, that maybe one way would be to focus more on such studies which are coming from no, and when we say bottom-up approach, sometimes it's still not going to the
Right.
bottom-most pyramid of the bottom. So I think that really needs to be touched upon.
And I think definitely. I think a lot of times at macro level discussions, we have this very top-down heaviness, which has to sort of, we have to move from that to create more sustainable structures. Coming
Yeah.
to a very interesting question, because you mentioned this in midst of our conversation, that how we teach environment,
Oh,
sustainability, or
yeah.
law.
Mm.
And again, very different fields, very different
Yes.
courses, especially in the Indian context. And
Yeah.
not necessarily a lot of times discussions on the intersectionalities between communities creep in these discussions or the way it is taught. So, how do
Mm.
you think that should change, if it should?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
how do we then move ahead with a new way of looking at these issues and how they've been taught?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The very, very important and crucial thing to understand, I guess. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of education keeps, undergoing these reforms where uh, we try to include a lot of, elements, different pedagogies, different methodologies. Uh, but I think it's at the end of it, it's also about the kind of narratives that get set because of certain way of teaching. So someone who's coming from a conservation science background would be looking at conservation as the key priority. And when you think of such things, say for example, there would be different approaches in that. One, but pure conservationists would be saying that wildlife can only thrive in isolation from human disturbances, and that is not true, right? The forest is the habitat of the people and the animals. So I think those those questions are there. We have legislations that are there that are talking about Forest Rights Act. There is a whole legislation that is talking about it, but these are very isolated legislations also. And when you talk about forest rights, you're not essentially then bringing in the element of conservation. That then it becomes people centric. One becomes very animal centric. uh, and it's also about how there's a lot of misinformation, especially I think this I talk about this in context of climate change, because um, it a lot of what is showed in media is often true but is missing a key. So say for example, a lot of magazines you'll see that would be showing a melted ice cap with a polar bear stranded on it, and Earth on fire, only droughts with no people in the picture. So something like that doesn't really, you still feel like this is not happening to me. So when you do, it's not that it's not important, but that cannot become the narrative. Carbon emissions cannot become the narrative for climate change. Now we have policies like carbon credit mechanisms, green credit. We have come up with something called as green credit. All of these are market-based incentives. They aim to do good things. They are economic instruments in some sense. So there is a lot of incentive for people to also participate. But at the same time, we have to be cautious that it doesn't really become only, and it has to be taught. I mean, it has to be to question. I think education, climate education, especially environmental education, you need to question that everything that is happening. Solar may look good, wind may look good, all of these things may look good, but we have to question it. And a very good example, again, I'm coming back to the Supreme Court judgment, because it's very interesting how a case for protection of two birds, the great Indian bustard and lesser florican, and ended up in such a recent, the huge development for climate jurisprudence in India. So if that could happen in just a legal context, imagine teaching it. If you're also letting students know about the conservation aspect of it, the wildlife aspect of things, as well as the people aspect of things, and especially when you interlink all of these together, can you actually find solutions? So I think a teaching, again, intersectionality is something I feel that I think has been the core in this dialogue. But I think the pedagogy really needs to be more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and has to take an intersectional approach. Otherwise, it is a lost opportunity.
Definitely, because these are also individuals who would then take ahead the conversation, the conservation efforts
And
and efforts around social and environmental sustainability ahead. Thank you
absolutely,
so much, Professor. This was a very interesting discussion, and I
yeah,
I must confess I had more questions to
yeah,
discuss
yeah,
and point,
great, great.
but I think that the time is limited.
Sure,
So
sure,
thank you so
yeah,
much. I think we all need to, in the end, look at things in a more intersectional, more interdisciplinary manner to sort of not only tackle climate change but also look at social sustainability. So let us end on that.
absolutely, absolutely.
So
On that note, yes. Thank you
thank
so much
you.
for having me here. You have a very good evening. Thank you so much.